welcome back. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa says peace and stability will remain elusive if we don't address the relationship between security and development. He also stressed that South Africa's foreign policy will always be guided by the achievement of peace. Khayelihle Khumalo has more on that.
A continent dealing with ferocious battles. The ANC says most of these conflicts in Africa are driven by weak civilian governance structures and worsening poverty. President Cyril Ramaphosa says this has given rise to conditions where populist movements collaborate with military leaders.
While peace has been achieved in some areas, there is still war and conflict in several parts of Africa. There is general recognition that peace and stability will remain elusive if we do not address the relationship between security and development. This requires a multifaceted approach that includes improved governance, entrenched democratic norms, respect for human rights, and the political will to capacitate our institutions.
President Ramaphosa also used his speech to defend the country's stance on Russia-Ukraine conflict. He reaffirmed that Pretoria will always advocate for a peaceful solution.
This conference is taking place during rising geopolitical tensions, which are evident in a number of conflicts that are happening, especially in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The effects of these tensions include growing food, energy, and financial crises, which affect poorer countries the most. We reiterate our pronounced position and our call for a negotiated solution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
The governing parties also supported calls for the reforms of the United Nations Security Council. This especially after the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, where the U.S. President Joe Biden backed Africa's long-standing demand to have a permanent seat at the global body.
It was pleasing to hear an articulation in that summit supporting the call that we have always made, that Africa needs to be represented on the United Nations Security Council. The message is beginning to sink. In line with our conference resolutions, South Africa continues to advocate for the reforms that will address this issue.
It's a speech that clearly shed light on South Africa's foreign policy, that the country maintains a position that is pro the global south, maintains the strength of multilateral institutions, particularly United Nations, as a pillar for peace and security. I think the President also touched on ANC's government views on core areas of its interest, particularly on the African continent, issues of silencing the gun, strengthening the AU.
The ANC has pledged solidarity with the people of Cuba, Palestine, and called for the removal of sanctions in Zimbabwe. Khayelihle Khumalo, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, for more on the ANC's foreign policy, we're joined now by SABC reporter Khayelihle Khumalo. Kaya, good evening to you. Long day, I know. Earlier on, interestingly, we were speaking with Professor Lisiba Defo, and he was speaking about the issue of border management and migration policy. And the President speaking about security and development earlier on. So no doubt those issues commingling with concerns around terrorism. Talk to me about what the tone was about this particular issue.
Well, absolutely, Tsepisa. So there's a great deal of concern about the rise of terrorism in Southern Africa, and this is in light of the developments that we have seen in the northern part of Mozambique in capital Gado, where currently you do have the SADC mission deployed, and South Africa is one of the countries that has contributed the troops. So the governing party in South Africa is concerned about the situation. So they're calling for more measures to be taken to address this, but also talking about of this phenomenon that is on the rise, where, we're also seeing the coups in other parts of the continent, calling for the strengthening of the institutions in terms of entrenching democracy, making sure that the institutions are well capacitated, but also addressing the social concerns as well, poverty, and dealing with a number of issues, the youth unemployment. So those are some of the issues that they are also just laying bare. But apart from that, they were reaffirming the position of South Africa's foreign policy that the issue of the achievement of peace will always be central for Pretoria. So when you talk about development, security is quite important.
And from the issue of security and development to conflict and development, South Africa, the role that is played in various conflicts, there's the Middle East conflict, of which it's been outspoken, well-known supporter of the Palestinians on the issue of nationhood and statehood. What did the president say about this? Because we know these are some of the guests, the representatives of these causes are at the ANC National Conference as allies. Did he talk about that? And the issue of Ukraine, South Africa has adopted a non-aligned stance, which has ruffled more than quite a few feathers.
Well, absolutely, Tshepiso, especially because quite a very good representation of so many of the former liberation movements from the neighboring countries here, Frelimo in Mozambique, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, as far as Polisario in Western Sahara, and also quite a very clear position about the ANC's support for self-determination in Palestine, and also calling for Israel to stop the violation of international law. But something that was very interesting as well from the president's speech was the admission in terms of making sure that the United Nations Security Council is able to represent the realities of the current global environment, because they do believe that the current system is outdated, especially because of the veto powers enjoyed by the P5 as opposed to the non-permanent members. So a very clear position from the ANC that it's high time that this very important institution that is supposed to maintain global peace remain effective by being reformed, so that it generally represents the interest of so many countries.
And it's interesting because multilateralism has more so, because of the conflict in Europe, been singled out as either being ineffective or pretty much falling apart. And the refusal, as some have put it, of being able to recognize that the world order is shifting is a conversation that's also being had. South Africa plays a very critical part on the continent in some of these conversations we've seen with the US-Africa tour and conversations around its relationship with China and Russia through blocs like BRICS. Does this kind of conversation then come up at a conference like this of the ANC? It's an next conference, but there are policies that are discussed there as well, hopefully.
Very much so, Tshepiso, especially because in light of the recent US-Africa Leaders Summit, so there was a very unflinching support from Washington, D.C. that it's high time that Africa does get a permanent seat within the UN Security Council, something that was quite interesting. So President Ramaphosa saying it was pleasing to see one of the P5 members supporting Africa, but of course it remains to be seen. What about the other four? Are they also supporting the similar position, especially because when a bulk of the issues that are being discussed are mainly about the peace and security of the continent? But apart from that, Tshepiso, very interesting, just once again, remarks by the president, where he was also defending the position of the South African government when it comes to non-alignment. You know that South Africa's Western allies have not been quite happy with South Africa's positions. Others call it unprovoked aggression, but South Africa does show its sympathy towards the Russians, especially because of their Soviet history. Some of the ANC members received military training in Soviet Union. So there's always that sympathy to say we're with Russia on this one.
Just a quick and final question, Khaya. It may seem strange me asking you, but I'm wondering if you've interacted with some of your, foreign news media colleagues and how they see this. ANC 55th National Congress might look like it's something that's only important regionally, but there is a great deal of media interest in this internationally.
And I tell you what, Seppi, so there was a point where there was a very first media briefing in the morning addressed by the spokesperson, Pulemabe. That room was incredibly full. You had so many major media houses. And whenever you speak to the colleagues from outside, I think there's always an appreciation of South Africa's importance, the ANC in terms of determining South Africa's future, at least for the next 5 years. So they always want to understand in terms of which way will the party take in terms of the policy adoption in so many instances. But also there was a great deal of the diplomatic corps as well, who were very eagerly awaiting, and they were terribly patient. I mean, they waited for 8 hours for the proceedings to officially kick off.
And it's another long day for you there tomorrow, Khaya. So let us release you, giving us a sense of the international report from President Cyril Ramaphosa's political report earlier on at the ANC's 55th National Congress. My colleague Khayelihle Khumalo. Do stay with us. So we've got more news on the future of the party. And of course, we'll take a look at what the tweets have been saying about the conference.